On a humid summer afternoon in Newport, Rhode Island, a powerful steel magnate takes a single wrong turn and walks into the pavilion that will change his life. There, among porcelain cups and working girls in plain uniforms, stands a woman who does not bow to his name, his fortune, or his world. Dorothy Ashdown carries a past Philadelphia tried to bury, and a courage that threatens everything Archer Rutledge was raised to protect. What happens when a man of industry meets a woman who refuses to be bought? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And one question: what do you love most about historical romances? The summer of 1895 had arrived in Newport with the heavy sweetness of a season determined to cling to the skin. Humidity curled along the manicured hedges of Bellevue Avenue, softened the immaculate lawns behind the grand cottages, and settled like a veil over the cliffs that guarded the restless Atlantic. At Mrs. Abernathy's sprawling estate, perched on a rise of stone that overlooked the sea, the afternoon sun turned the canvas pavilions into pale lanterns shimmering against the sky. Archer Rutledge stepped through one of those pavilions with the brisk confidence of a man accustomed to being expected. His linen suit, tailored in a pale shade of ivory, clung lightly to his frame, and the silver crest on his walking cane glinted with each purposeful stride. He was late for a meeting with his attorneys, who were finalizing the final details of a formidable steel merger. His mind lingered on numbers, on contracts, on the unrelenting forward motion of empire. He scarcely noticed the scent of bergamot in the air, nor the faint rustle of skirts, until he lifted his gaze and stopped short. He had walked into the wrong pavilion. Instead of polished legal minds waiting behind a table of documents, he found a gathering of young working-class girls, each standing at attention with porcelain cups balanced delicately between their fingers. At the center of them, like a quiet axis around which the entire scene revolved, stood Dorothy Ashdown. The light fell on her from the open flap of the tent, illuminating her walking dress of dusty blue wool and the off-white linen apron she wore over it. Her dark chestnut hair, parted with exacting neatness, had been drawn into a low bun, though a rebellious tendril brushed her cheek. Her features were composed, her grey-green eyes sharp with focus, as she observed the posture of a girl whose hand trembled ever so slightly. Archer opened his mouth to speak, but Dorothy beat him to it. "You are not expected here," she said, her tone calm, her words clipped with the soft precision of someone who had learned to speak plainly and without apology. Her voice was not rude. It simply did not bend. Archer, unaccustomed to such a greeting, stiffened. "I believe my meeting was scheduled for this location." Dorothy looked him over once, steadily, without lingering on the silk cravat, or the polished shoes, or the family crest carved into the cane he carried. She seemed to weigh him by entirely different measures. "This is the tea pavilion," she replied. "You must be searching for the legal tent on the western lawn. It is marked, though the summer breeze has a habit of shifting the signs." One of the trainees hid a smile behind her teacup. Archer noticed and felt the faintest prick of heat at his collar. "Then I was misdirected," he said, unable to keep the irritation from his tone. Dorothy did not flinch. "Then you have now been corrected." Archer should have left. Etiquette, dignity, and pride all suggested he turn on his heel and march across the lawn to the proper tent. But something held him there. Something in the way she stood, unbothered by his presence. Something in the confidence with which she commanded the attention of the young women around her. She lifted her hand and adjusted a trainee's grip on a teapot, her touch instructive yet gentle, her voice low and soothing. "Balance from the wrist," she murmured. "And remember, calm hands calm the guests." Archer found himself watching longer than was respectable. Her presence was not dramatic, not bold, not meant to command men. And yet she did, without lifting her chin, without raising her voice. He cleared his throat. "Your training session seems thorough." Dorothy looked at him then, truly looked. Her grey-green eyes were steady, appraising, as though she were deciding whether or not to bestow a polite response. "It must be," she said. "These young women hope for better wages this season. Skill gives them leverage. Precision gives them respect." Respect. The word struck Archer unexpectedly. He, who had commanded it all his life, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of a cool indifference he did not quite understand. She turned back to her group. "If you will excuse us, sir," she added, though the title sounded neither deferential nor warm. It was merely correct. Something inside Archer bristled. Something else, something quieter, tightened in recognition. He finally inclined his head. "Good afternoon, Miss Dorothy Ashdown." He filed the name away without knowing why. By the time he stepped back into the sunlight and crossed the lawn toward the correct pavilion, the heat felt sharper, as though the entire estate had shifted with the faintest tilt. He found his attorneys waiting, frustrated by his lateness. But Archer's thoughts drifted inexplicably back to the tea pavilion and the woman with steady hands and an unshakable spine. That evening, as he sat with other gentlemen in Mrs. Abernathy's west parlour, brandy swirling in crystal, the murmurs of polite society rising like perfumed smoke, someone mentioned her. A passing comment, a careless whisper. The tea mistress with the scandal in Philadelphia. Archer lifted his glass, but the amber liquid tasted different now. He should have dismissed the remark. He should have let the rumour vanish like so many others. But he did not. Dorothy Ashdown had unsettled him, not as a curiosity, not as a servant, as someone whose presence lingered long after he had left her behind, and as the night deepened and the whispers grew softer, her name remained in his mind, unexpected, unwelcome, and impossible to forget. The following morning, Newport awoke in golden stillness, its sea breeze softened by the hush of approaching ceremony. Along Ochre Point, maids aired out silk gowns and valets polished ivory buttons until their reflections shimmered back. The rehearsal tea at Mrs. Abernathy's estate was not just a gathering, it was a quiet contest of social precision, a stage upon which reputation stood trial beneath floral awnings and parasols. Dorothy Ashdown stood at the far end of the pavilion's gallery, her hands folded neatly over her apron, the lace collar of her dark Spencer jacket carefully pinned. Her eyes moved from one polished teapot to another, ensuring each station bore symmetry, calm, and exactitude. The girls under her instruction were dressed plainly but pristinely, the linen of their aprons starched to stiffness, their mob caps secure. Today, every movement mattered. This was the first event where the elite would taste not just tea, but the training she had instilled. Dorothy had earned the respect of Mrs. Abernathy's household staff through quiet discipline and the refusal to fawn over wealth. She asked for no more than she gave, excellence, effort, and dignity, and yet standing among silver spoons and sugared lemon slices, she knew the scrutiny would be merciless. Not from the staff, but from those who came draped in chiffon and inheritance. As the guests began to arrive, the air shifted. The scent of fresh roses mingled with perfume heavy with sandalwood. Lace gloves brushed embroidered fans, hats bloomed with peonies and stiffened ostrich plumes. The sound of measured laughter, always just a touch too loud, curled beneath the tent like smoke. Then she arrived. Evelyn Lorimer. Her entrance was not announced. It didn't need to be. Like all well-bred predators, Evelyn preferred quiet territory before striking. She wore a gown the color of iced champagne, its bodice trimmed with pale green silk rosettes that matched the ribbon woven through her parasol. Her ash-blonde hair was swept high in the most current Gibson arrangement, adorned with pearl pins that glinted like threat disguised as elegance. She walked not toward Mrs. Abernathy, but directly toward the tea station, toward Dorothy. "Miss Ashdown," Evelyn said, her voice as polished as the bone china cup she plucked from the table. "How very charming this all is." Dorothy offered a poised curtsy. "Thank you, Miss Lorimer. We strive for charm only when it serves the function." A flicker passed through Evelyn's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or satisfaction at finding her opponent alert. "Oh, but function is not always enough, is it?" Evelyn turned the cup in her gloved hand, then looked directly at Dorothy. "After all, reputation is its own kind of refinement, and some stains, though invisible, never quite wash out." The words settled like frost. Around them, conversation softened. One of the younger girls faltered in her pouring and had to be steadied. Dorothy held Evelyn's gaze without blinking. "I find," she replied, her voice low, "that true refinement is measured more by how one speaks of those who cannot answer." A breath caught somewhere nearby. "Mrs." Abernathy turned from her cluster of guests, her brows lifting slightly. Evelyn smiled, undisturbed. "Of course," she said, placing the cup down with theatrical grace. "Still, in Philadelphia, they do speak." Dorothy's jaw tightened. She felt the burn in her chest, a heat not of shame, but of memory. She bowed slightly and stepped back, returning to her girls, instructing them with quiet motions to continue. But inside, her pulse pounded with old echoes. That night, after the rehearsal ended and the girls had gone, Dorothy remained behind. The pavilion was silent now, the linens folded, the kettles emptied. A lantern burned on the table near the ledger. She removed her apron, unpinned her collar, and exhaled slowly into the dimness. Philadelphia. The word alone held weight. She had arrived there 3 years prior, with clean gloves and modest recommendations. The Carrington household had been grand, their library larger than her father's chapel back home. She had managed their dining staff with grace, their teas with excellence, and she had kept her voice low until the bruises on a young housemaid's arms told her silence was cowardice. Dorothy had spoken, calmly, clearly. She had documented, testified, and delivered the girl to safety. In return, she had been dismissed without references. The whispers began soon after, impropriety, insolence, overstepping. Not because she had lied, but because she had named the truth aloud in a room full of men who trafficked in shadows. Dorothy sat at the edge of the table and took out a small box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, carefully preserved, was a single letter, a reference from a cook who had dared defend her. It was written in uneven script, with phrases underlined twice, and the last line blurred slightly by tears. She read it again now. Then, with trembling hands, she reached for a fresh sheet of paper and dipped the quill. "Dear Mrs. Whitlow, I hope this letter finds you still in service at the Greenwich residence. I write with a request I would not make if I had any other path." Her handwriting was steady. Her pride had already been stolen once. She would not allow it to ruin her again. As the ink dried, Dorothy folded the letter and sealed it. She placed it beneath the corner of her ledger, where it would wait until she could send it with the morning post. Outside, the wind from the ocean pressed gently against the canvas walls. The salt in the air reminded her of movement, of tides that returned even after the fiercest storm. She would not let Evelyn Lorimer unravel her with whispers, but she knew now without doubt that this season in Newport would be no mere exercise in tea and etiquette. It would be a battle, fought not with noise, but with silence and glances, with lace and lies. And she, a woman dismissed for defending another, would have to hold her place not just with skill, but with fire disguised as calm. As she extinguished the lantern, her fingers lingered on the match, its head still warm. In her chest, the burn remained. Not shame, conviction. The skies above Newport softened into a dreamy haze by the 3rd week of July. The sea, ever temperamental, lay still like silver cloth beneath the cliffs, as if it too waited for something to break the surface. Morning mists clung to the hedgerows, dissolving slowly under the steady sun, and the estate grounds of Mrs. Abernathy bustled with the quiet rituals of refinement. Servants moved like shadows beneath awnings. Chairs were rearranged. Silver was buffed until it caught the light like ice. Dorothy Ashdown stood at the edge of the tea pavilion with a notebook pressed against her waist. Her gloved hands were ink-stained from revisions, placement charts, flavor pairings, linen rosters, but her eyes were fixed on something else entirely. Two of her trainees stood beside the lemon-glass table, trembling slightly as they tried to synchronize the pour of a fine Assam blend without letting the spouts tremble. "Not from the elbow," she called gently. "Guide it from the shoulder." "Fluid, like breath." One of the girls nodded, her concentration earnest, and tried again. Behind them, hidden partially in the shade of a flowering trellis, stood Archer Rutledge. He had no business there, not formally. His attorneys had no appointments scheduled, and Mrs. Abernathy had not summoned him. But he had wandered from the main house under the pretext of seeking air, and the path that wound around the rose beds had, quite conveniently, deposited him beside the service wing of the garden. There he lingered, watching. He told himself it was curiosity, perhaps even strategy. After all, Miss Ashdown's influence on the staff had become undeniable. Their discipline, their fluidity, their near-silent choreography of movements. It was as if she had summoned poise from the very dust beneath their heels. But as Archer leaned against the wrought-iron frame of the trellis, his eyes did not follow the girls. They followed her. Dorothy moved among them like a tide that knew its rhythm, correcting posture here, adjusting a saucer there, always without spectacle. Her voice was low, her presence constant. When one of the girls dropped a teaspoon and let out a gasp, Dorothy stepped beside her at once. "It's only silver," she whispered. "It can be polished. So can nerves." The girl laughed, half in relief, half in awe. Archer watched that moment, unblinking. It struck him, not as a matter of admiration or charm, but as something rarer. She was a woman used to fear, and yet she moved with a kind of internal steadiness that made others braver simply by standing near her. He hadn't meant to stay, but he found himself rooted, until she turned. Her gaze found him. She did not smile. She did not blush. She merely acknowledged him with the same measured calm with which she had corrected a crooked sugar spoon. "Mr. Rutledge," she said, her tone level, not unkind. "You've found the wrong pavilion again." He straightened, brushing invisible dust from his lapel. "It seems I'm prone to that mistake." Dorothy's lips tilted. Not quite a smile, not quite dismissal. "Then I suggest a map." He should have left then, but he didn't. "May I ask," he ventured, "how long it takes to train them to move like that?" Her chin lifted. "It depends on the girl, and how many times she's been told she is clumsy before someone proves otherwise." He felt the weight of those words, as one might feel a door close behind them. The tension between them was not theatrical. It was intimate in its restraint. Neither stepped closer. Neither looked away. Dorothy excused herself moments later, her steps silent against the polished wood of the pavilion floor. Archer remained only long enough to watch her disappear behind a curtain before finally turning back toward the estate house, unsure whether the heat in his chest came from the sun or something far more dangerous. That evening, after the guests had retired and the pavilion had emptied, Dorothy stayed behind to reorder the inventory list. The silence soothed her. She was halfway through counting teaspoons when she heard footsteps on the gravel behind the tent. She turned, expecting one of the staff girls who often forgot their kerchiefs. But it wasn't. The man standing before her was in his 50s, lean and weathered, his hands calloused, his boots scuffed from long travel. His name was Will Danner, and he had once worked in her father's foundry in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. "Miss Ashdown," he said with quiet urgency. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me, but it's about the merger." Dorothy's breath caught. She nodded once and led him toward the back of the pavilion where the servants took their breaks. They sat on two overturned crates behind a hedge of hydrangeas. The sky had darkened, and the crickets had begun their hymn. From his coat, Will pulled out a folded packet of papers, the edges worn soft from travel. His voice dropped lower. "This report was written by the community liaison," he explained. "It was supposed to be presented to Rutledge's lawyers, but the new partner, Crowthorne, buried it. Said it wasn't relevant. But it is. Dorothy unfolded the packet with deliberate care. The ink was smudged, but the meaning was clear. The steel merger being negotiated by Archer Rutledge and his associates would consolidate several regional operations, and in doing so, it would shutter the foundry in Bethlehem, her father's foundry, now run by former apprentices. Hundreds of men would lose their work, families would scatter, entire streets would vanish into silence. "This isn't public?" she asked, her voice low. Will shook his head. "They think nobody outside the boardroom will ever see it. They think we don't have anyone who'll speak." Dorothy looked down at the signatures at the bottom of the last page. The handwriting of men she remembered from her childhood. A foreman who had carried her on his shoulders. A clerk who had once taught her long division with chalk on the stone steps. The breath left her body like smoke. And for the first time in days, the sting of Evelyn Lorimer's insinuations felt irrelevant. This was real. When Will left, Dorothy returned to the pavilion and spread the papers across the table. She lit a lamp, the flame casting long shadows against the canvas. Her fingers traced the words slowly, then began to move toward another page, her own notebook. She began writing names, wages, routes, every resource she might call upon. She did not know what Archer Rutledge knew, or what he believed, but she knew what she had to protect. The girls she trained might be judged for their posture, but the men in her hometown were about to be judged disposable, and she would not be silent. Not again. Outside, the wind shifted, the sea stirred, and in Dorothy Ashdown's chest, something ancient and fierce began to rise. The days that followed settled over Newport like a silk veil pulled too tightly across a face, beautiful at first glance, but hiding strain beneath the sheen. By the time the sun rose on the morning that marked 5 days before the Ochre Point event, a hush had fallen over Mrs. Abernathy's estate. Even the birds seemed to chirp more cautiously, as if they sensed the quiet tremor moving beneath the preparations. Dorothy Ashdown arrived at the pavilion early, as she always did, though sleep had eluded her. The salt air brushed against her cheeks, cool and faintly scented with kelp. The wooden floor of the pavilion creaked in greeting as she stepped inside, setting down her ledger and lifting the covers off polished trays. Everything appeared orderly. Everything seemed to function. But tension has a scent of its own, faint yet unmistakable. She sensed it before she saw it. The girls moved about with stiff shoulders, exchanging glances they quickly concealed when her eyes met theirs. Their greetings lacked their usual lightness. Something had happened. Dorothy approached the nearest trainee, a bright-eyed girl named Lila, who had been improving steadily. Lila swallowed hard and clutched her apron. "Miss Ashdown, Ruth is not coming back." Dorothy paused. "Not coming back today?" "No," Lila whispered. "Not at all." The words dropped like a stone into the calm pool inside Dorothy's chest. Ruth had been her strongest trainee. Graceful hands, sharp memory, steady nerves. Dorothy had planned to place her at the primary pouring station during the Ochre Point event, a position of trust that could earn Ruth wages far above the season's usual rates. Dorothy inhaled carefully. Did she say why? Lila hesitated, eyes darting toward the tent flap, as if afraid Evelyn Lorimer might materialize from the clipped hydrangeas just outside. "She said she received an offer," Lila murmured, "from Miss Lorimer's cousin, double pay. She was told it would be unwise to stay." Dorothy closed her eyes for the briefest of seconds. Betrayal came in many forms. Some stabbed, some whispered, some opened their hands with coins glittering in the palm. She could not fault Ruth for choosing security, but the bruise of that choice spread quickly through her ribs. Dorothy thanked Lila calmly, then dismissed the girls to their stations. She stepped outside into the sunlight, lifting her face toward the wind. The cliffs stretched in jagged dignity before her, the ocean churning beneath, as if reminding her that nature survived broken tides without complaint. Evelyn had made her move. Dorothy would not yield. She returned inside with renewed determination. Her voice gathered strength, not loud but anchored, as she addressed the girls. "Shift assignments will change," she announced. "You will all learn each station today. Pouring, plating, balancing, greeting. No one will be confined to a single task." Several girls exchanged anxious glances. "But the visitors," one began. "Will see consistency," Dorothy interrupted, her tone firm yet steady. "Because you will be consistent. Because you will adapt. That is your strength." A hush fell. A few backs straightened, a few chins lifted, and something in the air changed just enough. The training began anew. Dorothy moved between them, adjusting wrists, repositioning shoulders, correcting posture with a gentle tap. She demonstrated pour angles, the ideal height of a teapot above a saucer, the precise curve of a bow when greeting guests. The girls learned. They wavered. They learned again. Dorothy's confidence fed theirs, even as her own heart throbbed with the knowledge that forces beyond the pavilion had begun to tighten their net. As the morning advanced, Mrs. Abernathy swept into the pavilion with the presence of a ship slicing through water. Her dark brocade gown rustled with each step, the lace fichu at her throat quivering with restrained emotion. "Dorothy, my dear," she began, her tone pleasant but taut. "A word." Dorothy followed her to the garden path outside. The roses were in full bloom, white petals glowing beneath the sunlight, though the air between them remained thick. "I have heard of Ruth's departure," Mrs. Abernathy said. "Most inconvenient." Dorothy kept her hands clasped. "I will adjust the assignments." "Yes, well," Mrs. Abernathy fluttered a hand. "That is as it must be. However, I must advise caution." "Caution?" Mrs. Abernathy's eyes narrowed slightly. "The Lorimers are an influential family, and Miss Evelyn, while not my favorite creature, has connections that extend beyond this estate." Dorothy remained silent. "I urge you," Mrs. Abernathy continued, her voice lowering, "not to provoke her, not with defiance, not with displays." Dorothy met her gaze squarely. "I did not provoke her." Mrs. Abernathy let out a sigh that carried both sympathy and self-preservation. "Intent is irrelevant. Perception rules this world, and the last thing the family needs is scandal. My guests must not see disorder among the staff. I trust you understand." Dorothy did. Far too well. The message beneath the surface was unmistakable. Behave, endure, do not embarrass us. Dorothy inclined her head, though her throat tightened at the quiet betrayal. "Yes, Mrs. Abernathy." When she returned to the pavilion, the girls read her expression instantly. They straightened their backs, as if preparing themselves for a storm that had not yet arrived. Dorothy continued the day's training with a renewed intensity, not frantic, not rushed, but resolute. She guided them through difficult maneuvers, corrected their missteps with calm hands, and praised their improvements with a gentleness that steadied trembling spirits. By late afternoon, the pavilion hummed with collective purpose. If they feared failure, they would overcome it through unity. Dorothy found comfort in that, but comfort was fleeting. As she rolled up the linen at the last station, she noticed a shadow preceding heavy footsteps near the tent's entrance. Archer Rutledge appeared beneath the frame of the pavilion, dressed in a charcoal vest with sleeves rolled to the forearms, a rare sight on a man who usually wore immaculate formality. He held a folder under one arm, its edges marked by creases. Dorothy felt her breath hitch, but she hid it expertly. "Miss Ashdown," he said with a nod. "Mr. Rutledge." His gaze moved slowly over the empty pavilion, lingering on small details. The aligned cups, the perfectly placed trays, yet never lingering long enough to make her self-conscious. Still, his presence rippled through the space, filling it with a tension neither of them fully acknowledged. "I heard," Archer said, "that one of your staff left unexpectedly." Dorothy stiffened. "News travels quickly, only because people speak carelessly," he replied. She met his eyes, level and unwavering. "Do you assume I lack the ability to recover?" his expression softened by a fraction. "I assume nothing of the sort." Yet something in his voice suggested he feared for her, not as an employer, but as a man uncomfortably aware of the injustices she faced. He hesitated before speaking again. "Miss Ashdown, if anyone has made your position here difficult, I hope you will tell me." Dorothy stepped back as if drawing from a well deep within herself. "I survive difficulty," she said. "I do not report it." Archer's jaw tightened, as though he wanted to protest, but he didn't. Instead, he shifted the folder in his hands. "I received a report this morning," he said quietly, "regarding the merger." The words struck her like a sudden downpour. Her gaze flickered to the folder, its paper edges softened like someone had read it more than once, but not thoroughly. "I haven't finished reviewing it," he added, his tone weighted. "The final section, I set aside for later." Dorothy swallowed. That was the section she carried in her apron pocket, the one that revealed the lives that would shatter. "I see," she murmured. He watched her carefully. There was something pained in his expression, something unspoken, something heavy. Her pulse quickened, though she held her composure. "I will leave you to your work," he said at last. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rutledge." He stepped out, though his shadow lingered on the floor for a moment after he departed. When the pavilion finally dimmed with the evening light, Dorothy reached into her apron pocket and removed the letter she had saved, the one written by the cook in Philadelphia, the woman who had dared defend her when few others did. Dorothy unfolded the letter slowly. The familiar handwriting brought a lump to her throat. It spoke of truth, of courage, of how a woman of integrity must often stand alone before being recognized. Dorothy pressed the letter against her chest, breathing deeply. She folded it with care and slipped it back into her pocket, her fingers tightening around the soft paper. Whatever storm awaited her, Evelyn, the merger, the whispers, she would face it. She had learned long ago that some women carried their armor beneath their skin where no one could see it coming. And as the waves crashed against the cliffs beyond the estate, Dorothy Ashdown stood in the quiet pavilion with her shoulders squared, ready for whatever came next. The air in Newport that week turned sharp, not with cold, but with tension, the kind that settles in the lungs and makes each breath feel like a question. The roses bloomed as if unaware of the quiet war brewing beneath their thorns, and the cliffside breeze that once brought reprieve now carried with it something sour, whispers. At first, they arrived like wind against the canvas, soft, subtle, easily dismissed. A glance held too long, a pause in conversation as Dorothy passed, an unfinished sentence between two society matrons, punctuated by a raised brow and a fan pressed just so against a painted mouth. Dorothy noticed. She always noticed. She kept her posture immaculate, her voice calm, her work flawless, but the murmurs grew. A hostess who had confirmed her services for a private breakfast now sent regrets, citing unexpected changes to the guest list. One of the younger trainees approached her in tears after overhearing a guest refer to Dorothy as that woman from Philadelphia who forgot her place. The girls rallied around her, fiercely loyal, their eyes darting toward anyone who dared question her authority. But loyalty could not stop erosion. It merely delayed it. Dorothy moved through each day with the precise grace of a woman walking across ice, knowing that beneath her was a truth no one wanted to hear. That her past had never been shameful. It had only been inconvenient for those with power. She had stood for a girl who had been bruised in silence, and for that they had tried to ruin her. Now they were trying again. One afternoon, as the pavilion emptied after another tense rehearsal, Dorothy remained behind to reorder supplies. The light fell in fractured gold through the canvas walls, casting shifting shadows. She reached for a new ledger sheet when she heard her name. "Miss Ashdown." She turned. Archer Rutledge stood at the entrance, holding a folder in one hand. The evening wind rustled his coat, but he looked rooted, tense, as though fighting something unseen. "I read it," he said. His voice was quiet but resolute. Dorothy's heart beat once, hard. "All of it?" she asked. He nodded. She waited, but he did not speak. Instead, he stepped inside and placed the folder gently on the table between them. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. His eyes searched her face. "This merger," he began, "would devastate your town. Your people." "Our people," she corrected, her voice soft but firm. "I grew up among them, but they forged your fortune." He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Dorothy took a breath, then another. She did not want to cry. She wanted clarity. "I imagine you have decisions to make," she said. "I've made one," Archer replied. That surprised her. "I want to offer my help. Not through the merger, through you. I can support your work here, fund your staff, offer a reference, quiet the rumors." Dorothy's expression did not change, but a cold stillness crept into her chest. "A reference," she echoed. Archer stepped closer, his voice lowered. "This scandal, this campaign, they're coming after you, and we both know why. I have the power to stop it." "No," she said simply. He blinked. "You misunderstand." "I don't," she interrupted, stepping back. "You want to help without standing beside me. You want to lift me in secret so you can soothe your conscience without risking your name. That's not, it is." Her voice shook, not with fear, but with fury held at bay. Her hands remained still at her sides, but her spine burned with every word. "I will not be your charity," she said, "and I will not be your secret." Archer's face darkened. "You think this is easy for me?" "No," she said. "I think it's easier for you than it is for me, because when they whisper about me, they speak of disgrace. When they whisper about you, they call it strategy." He moved closer, no longer trying to hide the frustration in his voice. "You're so concerned with pride that you would rather drown than let someone throw you a rope." Dorothy's eyes flashed. "A rope handed in the shadows is a leash." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind outside grew louder, thrashing against the canvas. A fork clinked faintly as it rolled from its place on the table. Dorothy walked past him, steady and cold, and picked it up, placing it back with care. "I did not survive Philadelphia to be saved," she said quietly. "I survived to stand." He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand along the back of his neck. "You think I haven't paid for my comfort? You think I haven't earned the right to wrestle with these decisions?" Her voice softened, but it lost none of its conviction. "You haven't earned the right to offer redemption while still profiting from silence." That struck him. The look in his eyes changed, less defensive, more wounded, as if her words had hit something he had never wanted named. He nodded once, slowly, and stepped back. "I came to offer help," he said. "You came to make peace with yourself." Archer opened his mouth, then closed it. He gathered the folder he had brought, turned on his heel, and walked out of the pavilion. Dorothy watched the canvas flap settle behind him. Her breath escaped her like a thread pulled from a seam. She moved to the table and sat down heavily, her hands trembling only slightly. The summer heat pressed in around her, and outside, the sounds of the sea grew louder. She had told him the truth, but truth was never tidy. It did not bring comfort. It brought distance. And now she felt the echo of it settle between them like a door locked from both sides. Still, she did not regret it. She opened the ledger, dipped her pen, and wrote 3 new names into the shift list for the Ochre Point event. She would train replacements. She would quiet the murmurs with precision. She would survive this season, not by hiding, but by standing taller than the scandal that tried to bend her. And if the world insisted on calling her difficult, ungrateful, unruly, then so be it. She would wear those words as armor, and Archer Rutledge, for all his wealth and want, would have to decide what kind of man he wished to be, one who watched her from a distance, or one who stood beside her when it mattered most. But for now, Dorothy Ashdown stood alone, and she stood with dignity. The morning dawned bright and brittle, the sky over Ochre Point a deceptive wash of pale blue and gold. It was the kind of light that dared one to trust it, though the wind told another story. Out on the cliffs, the Atlantic muttered to itself in tones of warning, and the gulls flew lower than usual, their cries more urgent than curious. Newport, in its lace and linen, dressed for spectacle, but nature, ever untamed, had no interest in civility. The great garden party was to be Mrs. Abernathy's crowning event of the summer. Invitations had been etched on parchment and delivered by hand. A quartet had been hired from New York. The guest list included congressmen, heirs, ambassadors, and the whispering shadows of at least 3 European titles. Every shrub on the estate had been trimmed to geometric perfection. The fountain in the rose garden had been scrubbed and polished until it mirrored the sky. But by mid-morning, clouds began to gather. Dorothy Ashdown stood on the eastern lawn, her eyes fixed not on the decorations or the arrangements, but on the sky, watching as the blue turned to pewter in thin, creeping layers. Behind her, the pavilion was a hive of movement. The girls moved swiftly, quietly, dressed in their freshly pressed uniforms, their hair neatly pinned, their faces a blend of nerves and resolve. For them, this event was not leisure. It was a trial. Dorothy's fingers tightened around the edge of the tray she carried. She had not slept well. Her thoughts had been haunted by the conversation with Archer, by the weight of standing alone in a world that preferred its women obedient and unseen. She had not seen him since their argument. She hadn't expected to. He would be among the guests today, undoubtedly, flanked by his allies, perhaps even Evelyn, but she had made peace with the silence between them. Her work was her voice now. A clap of thunder, distant but distinct, drew the attention of everyone on the lawn. Eyes lifted, murmurs spread. Several guests, already arriving in carriages, hesitated beneath their parasols. Dorothy turned to Lila, her most dependable trainee. "Move the tea service," she said. "Now!" "To where?" Lila asked. "The covered gallery behind the west wing, stone floor, open arches. It will echo, but the wind can't touch us there." Lila blinked. "We'll have to rearrange everything," Dorothy said. "Yes, we will, and we'll do it in under 30 minutes." The girls moved. Dorothy directed them with the calm of a general. Tables lifted by 4, not dragged. Linens refolded mid-stride, chairs carried 2 at a time. Platters, teapots, china, all moved with the grace of a performance rehearsed, though never under these conditions. The gallery was long and narrow, flanked by stone columns and a low stone wall that overlooked the orchard. Vines climbed the corners. The scent of thyme and distant salt clung to the air. It was not where the elite expected to sip tea, but it would have to do. Within moments, the transformation began. Teas were placed, menus rewritten in clean ink, linens laid with swift precision. Candles were lit to warm the shadowed corners as thunder rumbled closer. And then came the final touch. Dorothy, hands trembling but steady, placed a small folded card at each setting. Each bore the name of a tea blend, but beneath the name a line, blended in honor of followed by a name. Not of nobility, not of donors, of laborers. A black tea named for Joseph Talbot, the stonemason who laid the estate's foundation. A chamomile for Grace Henley, seamstress to Mrs. Abernathy's great-grandmother. A lavender blend honoring Elijah Boone, gardener, widower, and former slave. The girls placed the cards without question. They trusted Dorothy. And when the first guests entered, the gallery glowing with lamplight, the low sound of the quartet echoing faintly in the distance, there was a hush that fell, not out of discomfort, but of recognition. For once, something had been made not merely to impress, but to mean. Dorothy stood near the entrance, her spine straight, her hands folded at her waist. She greeted each guest with quiet dignity, noting their confusion, their curiosity, their reluctant admiration. And then Evelyn arrived. She swept into the gallery in a gown of soft grey silk with storm-coloured feathers at her collar, as if she had dressed to match the sky. Her smile was slow and deliberate, her eyes as sharp as the pins in her hat. She did not look at Dorothy until the very moment the footman announced her name. Then she turned. "Well," she said, her voice light as whipped cream, "the storm must have followed you." Dorothy inclined her head. Or perhaps it simply chose the only place brave enough to stand still. The smile on Evelyn's lips remained frozen, but her gaze narrowed. "An unusual theme," she murmured, lifting one of the cards. "In honor of a gardener. What a charming peasant tableau." "It's a reminder," Dorothy replied, "of who holds the ground beneath your feet." Evelyn laughed, then turned toward a small knot of guests gathering near the far table. Her voice carried deliberately. "I do wonder," she said, "how many of these stories are real. Then again, Miss Ashdown has always been known for her inventive narratives." Dorothy heard the words as if they had been struck against glass. Several heads turned. A ripple of attention shifted in her direction. For a breath, a heartbeat, silence pressed against her skin like damp velvet. Dorothy stepped forward. "Some of you may have heard," she said clearly, her voice even, "that I was dismissed from a household in Philadelphia." A few fans stilled mid-motion. "It is true," she continued. "I was dismissed after speaking on behalf of a young maid who had been mistreated. I was told that my concern over her bruises was not my place. When I insisted it was every woman's place, I was given 1 hour to leave." More silence. More watching. Dorothy looked at no one in particular, yet she felt their eyes. "I have made mistakes," she said, "but silence in the face of cruelty is not one of them." Then she stepped back, folded her hands, and waited. No one moved. No one spoke. The music faltered, then resumed. It was Evelyn who turned first, with a tight laugh and a flick of her fan. But the damage had been done, to her. Guests began to read the cards more closely. They sipped more slowly. Dorothy stood beneath the arches as the rain finally broke above them, pounding against the stone roof like applause. The scent of storm and bergamot mingled in the air, and somewhere deep in the gallery, a guest raised a cup and murmured, "To the gardener." Archer Rutledge arrived late. He entered silently, his coat damp from the rain, his eyes scanning until they found her. He said nothing. She did not move. But across the gallery, their eyes met, just once. And in that single, unspoken moment, something shifted, not resolved, not forgiven, but seen. And in a world that had tried to silence her, Dorothy Ashdown had never wanted anything more than to be seen, and to remain standing. The storm broke over Ochre Point with an authority no invitation could silence. Rain fell in thick sheets across the cliffs, lashing against the stone arches of the gallery and drenching the manicured lawns beyond. The wind, once playful, had turned purposeful, tugging at parasols and shaking the heavy vines that clung to the terrace columns. Thunder rolled across the coast in long, groaning waves, echoing through the open arches like the low growl of something ancient and awakening. Inside the gallery, lamplight flickered. The scent of bergamot, lavender and candle wax mingled with the damp air, and the guests, dressed in silks and cashmere, their gloves still drying from the first wave of rain, sat in a hush that teetered between discomfort and revelation. The tables still bore their blends, each card a quiet act of defiance, each cup a tribute to hands the world rarely noticed. Dorothy Ashdown stood behind the central service table, her spine straight despite the ache settling in her shoulders. Her uniform, once pristine, bore faint signs of effort, a smear of soot from a dropped lamp, a wet patch at her hem from moving crates through the rain. But her face was composed, almost serene. Her girls moved around her with a practiced grace that belied their youth. Their fear had become focus. The storm, it seemed, had not scattered the guests as expected. It had sealed them in, and that, in itself, was its own kind of reckoning. Voices were low, hesitant. Porcelain clinked gently. No one dared raise a voice, not after Dorothy's measured confession, not after Evelyn's thinly veiled assault had been returned with truth spoken in full light. The music had stopped, and then, quietly but clearly, his name was announced. Mr. Archer Rutledge. Heads turned. A few gasps were audible. Dorothy did not move, though her pulse leapt in her throat like a startled bird. He stepped into the gallery with his hat in one hand and rein clinging to the shoulders of his dark coat. His hair, usually so carefully combed, bore the damp disarray of a man who had not waited for shelter. His eyes searched the room with precision until they found her, and only then did he begin to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm but not loud, "I won't interrupt your gathering for long." The room stilled. Dorothy held her breath. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and removed a folded document, softened at the edges. "I came today to fulfill a promise," he said, opening the paper slowly, "but I find that what I intended to say has changed." Evelyn, seated near the center, stiffened visibly. Her fingers clutched her fan as if it were a blade. Archer glanced at the paper, then let it rest on the table nearest him. "The merger I've been preparing these past months will not go forward." A collective inhale surged through the crowd like a wave hitting stone. "I have reviewed every figure," he continued. "Every footnote, every consequence, the towns that would close, the lives that would be uprooted, and I have made my choice." He paused, not for effect, but because the weight of his next words needed space. "I will not build an empire on ash." Evelyn stood. The scrape of her chair rang like a shot. "You would humiliate me here," she said, her voice sharp, high, edged with disbelief. Archer turned to face her, calm but resolute. "I will not marry for preservation," he said, "or for silence." Her face, so carefully composed in powder and rouge, cracked beneath the shock. She looked at him, then at Dorothy, whose expression had not changed, whose eyes simply waited. "This," Evelyn hissed, "will not be forgotten." "No," Archer replied. "I hope it won't." And with that, Evelyn Lorimer turned, her skirts snapping like thunder, and walked into the rain. Her departure was not silent, but no one followed. The storm outside howled. A few guests rose, uncertain whether to remain or retreat. But most stayed, their teacups still warm in their hands, their eyes fixed on the woman at the center of it all, Dorothy, who had said nothing through it all, who now turned calmly back to her team. She gave a nod. Service resumed. It was then, as one of the girls attempted to cross the room with a heavy silver tray, that the final test came. The tray slipped. It struck the floor with a crash of breaking china and spilled tea, the sound like glass shattering across the cliffs. A gasp rose. The girl froze, paralyzed with fear, her hands shaking. Dorothy was the first to move. She crossed the floor in 3 steps, knelt beside the mess, and placed one hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "It's only porcelain," she said softly. "We are not made of it." One by one, the other girls joined her. On their knees, in fine shoes and damp skirts, they began gathering the shards, blotting the tea, restoring order without frenzy. Then, something extraordinary happened. Archer stepped forward. He did not speak. He knelt beside Dorothy, took a cloth from the table and began to clean, in silence, in humility, in unity. No gesture could have spoken louder. The gallery watched. Not all understood, not all approved, but none looked away. When the tray was cleared and the pieces gathered and the service resumed, something unspoken had settled in the air, a shift that could not be undone. Dorothy rose slowly. Her eyes met Archer's. He did not offer a smile. She did not offer thanks. But there was something between them now, not truce, not affection, recognition. For the first time, they were not on opposite ends of a conflict. They were side by side in the aftermath. The rest of the evening passed in a kind of dazed stillness. Some guests left early, citing the weather. Others lingered, watching Dorothy's team as if seeing them anew. The cards at each table were not just conversation pieces now. They were mirrors. Dorothy remained until the last guest had gone, the last cup washed, the last candle extinguished, and when she stepped outside into the storm, the wind whipping her hair loose from its pins, she did not flinch. Behind her, Archer waited. He said nothing. She walked past him slowly with measured steps, but just before reaching the path that led toward the servants' wing, she paused. Without turning, she said, "That was not charity today." His voice came soft behind her. "No, it wasn't." And then she walked on, into the night, into the rain, into whatever would come next. But not alone. Not anymore. The morning the paper arrived, the air in Newport was deceptively gentle. Sunlight spilled in golden streaks through the tall windows of the main house, dappling the floors with patterns that might have suggested peace to someone less practiced in expectation. But Dorothy Ashdown had lived long enough to know that stillness could mask rupture. She held the newspaper in both hands, the ink already staining her gloves. Her heart did not race, her breath did not falter. What Evelyn had done no longer surprised her. It only confirmed what Dorothy had always known. The world, when challenged by a woman who refused to kneel, often bit back. The editorial took up nearly half a column in a well-known Philadelphia paper. Though unsigned, it was elegantly worded, wrapped in the language of civility that disguised its venom. It spoke of a tea mistress in Newport, whose moral record remains unsubstantiated. It referenced a dismissal from a prominent family due to boundary overstepping. It warned hostesses to vet thoroughly those entrusted with the intimacy of their private affairs. Nowhere did it name her directly, but everyone knew. The article had already made its way into the hands of guests, staff, and whispering circles beyond the estate. A footman left a clipped copy beside Mrs. Abernathy's breakfast tray. One of the younger maids had wept in the linen room after reading it aloud. The girls at the tea pavilion stood with stiff backs and trembling lips, awaiting the reckoning they feared must come. Dorothy folded the paper carefully and placed it in the center of the table. She said nothing. Not yet. It was Mrs. Abernathy who came to her first, mid-morning, after a silence that lasted longer than politeness would usually allow. She wore navy blue that day, her shawl pinned with jet beads, her voice quiet but edged with something unfamiliar. "I read it," she said. Dorothy turned to face her, chin lifted. "I'm sure many have." Mrs. Abernathy hesitated. Then, in a voice more brittle than Dorothy had ever heard from her, she said, "I hosted that family. I know the wife. I remember her sighing about staff who didn't understand their place, but I never asked what that meant. I should have." Dorothy didn't reply. "Would you permit me," the older woman said carefully, "to correct my mistake?" Dorothy blinked once. "I beg your pardon. I've invited 2 journalists from the Newport Herald to observe the work in the tea pavilion tomorrow. I told them your girls deserve a page of their own, a page that speaks of discipline, training, and courage. Let others write shadows. I will host light." Dorothy's throat tightened, not because she needed to be defended, but because someone had chosen to see her, not in silence, but in action. "I would be honored," she whispered. Word of the visit spread quickly. That afternoon, Archer appeared, not with flowers or condolences, but with letters. He met Dorothy near the edge of the orchard, where the girls had gathered for their final afternoon drill. The grass was still damp from morning mist, and the faint scent of baked pears lingered in the air. "I sent inquiries," he said, handing her a stack of folded pages. Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "To whom?" "Everyone in Philadelphia who might speak honestly of you, not out of pity, but because truth should be spoken with the same boldness as lies." Dorothy hesitated before unfolding the first letter. It was from a former housekeeper, one who had worked under the same roof where the scandal began. "She stood for a girl with no voice," it read, "and when no one listened, she didn't whisper. She insisted, 'I have never forgotten that, and I never will.'" Dorothy read every word, her eyes burning but dry. Another letter spoke of her training, her compassion, her refusal to compromise where injustice lived. A third recounted how she had once returned half her wages to pay for a widow's coal. She held the stack to her chest. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let them be heard," Archer said. "Say you'll let others see you as you are." She met his gaze. It had softened, not out of pity, but reverence. There was no distance in it now, no careful calculation. "Then I will," she said. The following day, the journalists arrived. 2 women, both dressed in serviceable wool coats and low hats, their notebooks already open before they stepped past the threshold. Dorothy greeted them without fanfare. She did not present herself as spectacle. She showed them the girls, the drills, the mistakes and recoveries. She showed them the trembling hands and the triumphant ones. She spoke of training not as etiquette, but as empowerment. And when Lila, once too timid to speak above a whisper, delivered a full tea service to the reporters with perfect composure and introduced the working woman's Earl Grey in honor of a local nursemaid, the elder of the 2 journalists closed her notebook. "I believe," she said softly, "we've found our headline." That evening, Dorothy returned to the pavilion alone. The wind had calmed, the lamps burned low. The silence, for once, did not feel like exile. It felt like peace. She found Archer waiting near the stone arch. He did not speak immediately. He handed her an envelope. Dorothy opened it. The letter was from a man named Jacob Flint, a laborer from the foundry in Bethlehem. It had been delivered to Archer after his visit, after he had walked the cracked streets of the industrial town and seen with his own eyes what had been left behind. The letter was simple. "I heard you listened. I heard you changed course. That's enough for me to hope again. Not for me, for my boy. Thank you." Dorothy folded the letter with reverent care. "I wasn't sure you'd go," she said. "I wasn't sure I could face it," Archer replied, "but I couldn't forget your words." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped forward. "Boston has offered me a position," she said, "to manage a tea room in Beacon Hill. Clean reputation, double the salary." His face betrayed nothing. "Are you taking it?" "No." She turned toward the orchard. "I'd rather stay and fight in the open," she said, "where my girls can see me do it." Archer's voice was low, careful. "Then allow me to stand with you, not behind, not ahead, beside." Dorothy did not answer right away. She looked toward the cliffside where the sea darkened and the horizon blurred, where wind and water never bowed to rumor. Then she turned to him, eyes clear. "Yes," she said, "but only if you kneel when I do." He smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won, but of a man who had finally understood. And in that small corner of Newport, beneath the twilight sky, something long held in tension softened, not into resolution, but into trust. And that, at last, was the beginning of something they could both build. The pavilion stood silent beneath the late September sky, its white columns dappled with golden light as the sun slipped through thinning leaves. Autumn had arrived in Newport with its familiar hush, less grand than summer, more honest. There were no orchestras rehearsing, no champagne being poured behind silk-draped trellises. Instead, there were hammers, polish, and the scent of beeswax. The tea pavilion, once a borrowed stage, was now hers. Dorothy Ashdown stood at the entrance, keys in hand. She had waited until the carpenters finished, and the sign bearing her name was hung with proper care. Now, for the first time since arriving in Rhode Island, she unlocked a door that bore no one else's title but her own. The deed lay safely in a desk drawer, signed and witnessed, filed at the courthouse in Newport. Though Archer had arranged the financing, quietly, insistently, his name appeared nowhere on the document. Dorothy had made certain of that. She accepted his assistance not as dependence, but as partnership offered freely and without claim. The engraved plate outside now read, "Ashdown Academy for Hospitality and Independent Women." The girls had helped choose the name. They had voted on it together around a battered trestle table one afternoon after drills. Some had proposed fanciful titles, the Society of Teacups or the Order of Refinement, but Dorothy had merely raised an eyebrow and asked, What are we actually building here? Freedom, one had said. Decency, said another. And so it was decided. They were not curtsying toward gilded illusion, but standing for something earned with calloused hands and sharpened minds. Inside, the training hall had been scrubbed to brilliance. The former parlour had become a practice room with chalkboards and height-adjusted tables. Shelves held linens folded to exacting standards. There were ledgers for inventory practice, sample invitations for correspondence drills, and a battered upright piano for posture lessons during tray balancing. Each morning, the girls arrived in uniform, fitted blue dresses with crisp white aprons, their collars trimmed with handmade lace. A small silver pin, shaped like a kettle, was worn over the heart. Dorothy wore no pin. She didn't need one. She moved among them like a conductor, observing, correcting, encouraging with a nod or a touch. No one called her Miss Ashdown. They simply called her Director, and the word carried no stiffness, only respect. Archer came by on Thursdays, always Thursdays. He never disrupted the drills. He stood at the edge of the gallery, arms crossed lightly, leaning against the stone railing. Sometimes he brought pastries. Once he brought a new chalkboard after noticing the old one squeaked. He never lingered past his welcome. On one visit, he handed her a long, narrow box wrapped in navy ribbon. Dorothy hesitated before accepting it. Inside was a silver kettle, small but exquisitely made. On one side, her initials. On the other, her father's, J.A. She looked up. "I had to guess the year," Archer said softly. "I thought it might be the one your father opened his first workshop." "It is," she said, her voice steady, though her hand trembled slightly. She placed the kettle on a high shelf in her office. She never used it. It wasn't meant for tea. It was a legacy in metal and memory, but not everyone welcomed the Academy's success. 3 weeks after the opening, Dorothy received a note, unsigned but unmistakably authored by Mrs. Valia Kirkbridge, one of Newport's most vocal hostesses. It read, "This season's conservatory tea will remain a private affair. Thank you for understanding the delicacies of discretion." The implication was clear. Dorothy's reputation, though no longer scandalous, was still too unconventional for Thalia's liking. Her students might serve at others' tables, but Dorothy herself was not welcome at them. She placed the note in the same drawer where the deed rested. She did not respond. Mrs. Abernathy, however, responded for her. The following Sunday, at the end of a reading circle hosted at the gallery, she stood, cleared her throat, and addressed the dozen women gathered beneath the late blooms of the rose arbor. "I've heard," she said, "that some among us believe it improper to invite innovation into our homes." Several teacups paused mid-air. "I should like to clarify that I consider Dorothy Ashdown's work to be the only service worth copying this season, and I would very much like her girls to cater my daughter-in-law's luncheon." Not a whisper followed her statement, only the sound of one teaspoon gently settling into its saucer. Dorothy heard about it 2 hours later, from a trainee who had been pouring for the event. She said nothing, but that evening she sent a bouquet of violets and dusty Miller to Mrs. Abernathy's room with a note that read only, "For clarity, not apology." The days grew shorter. Leaves turned. Girls laughed louder in the halls. One was offered a position managing a dining room on Bellevue Avenue. Another was proposed to by a dock worker's son with ink-stained hands and a velvet ring box. A third was training to take over linen operations entirely. Dorothy watched them all without envy, only pride. One afternoon, as the wind turned brisk and the sea grew restless, she stood once again at the pavilion's edge. Archer arrived as he always did, but this time he did not stay outside. He walked beside her silently, matching her pace. They stood together, watching the gulls wheel against the grey horizon. "I keep thinking," he said at last, "how many decisions in my life were made with ink and pressure. Sign here, promise this, bind that." Dorothy didn't answer. "I've never been more certain of something," he added, "than I was when I placed your name alone on that deed." She looked at him then. "Because you trusted me?" No, he said quietly, because I finally understood the difference between possession and presence. She turned back to the sea. I don't need you here, she said. I know, but I'm glad you come. He nodded once, and they stood in silence as the tide rolled in, not with thunder but with rhythm, predictable, steady, earned. It was not the end of something, but the settling of foundation, strong, unadorned, built not with vows or spectacle, but with choice. And that, to Dorothy, was worth more than any silver ever forged. The gallery had never looked more alive. A year had passed since Dorothy Ashdown stood at its threshold, uncertain of her future, her hands trembling beneath the weight of public scrutiny. Now, beneath the same carved eaves and over the same stone floor that once felt like a stage for her ruin, laughter floated like music. Napkins fluttered in the summer breeze, cream-colored and edged in the same lace the girls had stitched by hand. The scent of bergamot and lemon verbena wafted gently through the air. Porcelain cups clinked like glass bells in the hands of women who had once feared to raise their voices, let alone their gaze. It was the first annual Ashdown summer tea. There were no banners, no orchestras, no garlands hung for effect. Only tables covered in linen, trays arranged with quiet care, and faces, dozens of them, watching not for scandal but for ceremony. They had come not to observe a curiosity but to witness a triumph, quiet and earned. Dorothy wore a pale blue dress that matched the sky above. Her apron was embroidered with the Academy's crest, a silver kettle within a laurel wreath, and her hair was pinned with delicate care at the nape of her neck. She moved from table to table, greeting each guest with the same composure she had cultivated through years of discipline. She asked after their families. She remembered the names of their cooks. She inquired about charities, illnesses, husbands and daughters, with grace so seamless that no one noticed the way her hand curled slightly around the silver tray she carried, holding onto the moment as if it might vanish. Around her moved the girls, now young women, who had once come to her wide-eyed and bruised by life. They poured, balanced, wiped and smiled with the polish of Parisian hostesses and the confidence of something better. Women who knew their worth. Maribel, once too afraid to speak above a whisper, now led instruction at the Academy. Clara had moved to Providence and opened a kitchen that supplied two of the city's finest cafes. She had returned today in a crimson day gown and matching gloves, beaming with a pride she no longer apologized for. And Ruth, sweet, stubborn Ruth, had married a merchant who had once refused her employment. Now, she funded scholarships for girls who could not yet dream beyond dishwater and duty. Dorothy watched them all, with a heart full not of ownership, but reverence. By late afternoon, the sun had lowered to a buttery angle, casting long shadows across the gallery. It was then, as she placed her final teacup onto the arm of a quiet guest in mourning, that she saw him. Archer Rutledge stood at the far edge of the terrace, as he always did, never at the centre, never demanding entrance. He wore a linen suit in a soft grey, the lapels slightly wind-tossed, and in his hand he held not flowers nor a gift-box, but a folded sheaf of parchment bound in ribbon. Their eyes met. He did not smile, not quite. But something shifted in his stance, an almost imperceptible change in the way his shoulders set, as though this moment bore weight. Dorothy approached him slowly. The guests around them continued their conversations. The girls carried on with practiced focus. The world did not pause, but for Dorothy and Archer, the moment was utterly still. He held out the parchment. "This is for you," he said, "though I'd rather say, for us." She untied the ribbon and unfolded the pages with practiced care. The ink was fresh, the signatures bold, the title precise, Charter of the Ashdown Rutledge Foundation. She looked up. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "It's not a business. It's not a merger. It's a foundation for education, training, and dignity. A place where women can learn, teach, and never again be silenced for their decency." Dorothy held his gaze. No patronage? Only partnership, he said. No ownership? He shook his head. Only purpose. A silence passed between them that felt like the last breath before a decision that could not be unmade. Then what do you ask of me? She asked. He drew a breath, not to gather courage, but to steady it. I ask you to build it with me, to live alongside me, not beneath or behind, to shape something that will outlast both our names. I don't ask for your hand, he said softly. I ask for your will. Dorothy looked down at the paper, her name already written at the top in the hand of the notary. She had not signed it yet. That power remained hers. When she looked up, her eyes did not glisten, they burned. You should know, she said. I will never be easy. I do not bend to fashion, and I will not bow to comfort. I didn't come for easy, he replied. I came for truth. Then, without performance or declaration, she nodded. Yes, she said. He didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he offered her a teacup from a passing tray. They turned together toward the guests. Without a bell or signal, the clinking quieted. All eyes turned toward the gallery's edge. Dorothy lifted her cup. To those who were told they were too much, she said, and to those who were told they were not enough, to the ones who were asked to serve in silence, to the ones who said no, she paused, her voice steady, to the women who taught me that worth is not inherited, and that dignity does not require permission. Archer raised his cup beside hers. And to those who dare build something new, he said. The guests rose. The applause that followed was not thunderous. It was reverent, soft, sure, not for spectacle, but for survival, for integrity, for a love steeped not in wealth, but in worth. And as the golden light spread across the stone and linen, the gallery glowed, not as a monument to triumph, but as a home for all things quietly, stubbornly beautiful. It was the end of one story, and the beginning of something braver. It was early June in Newport, and the sea was quieter than usual. The gulls called less often. The wind moved with gentler rhythm, and the old rose vines along the gallery had begun to bloom earlier than expected, their pale petals curling like the edges of old letters. Everything felt touched by memory. The Ashdown Rutledge Foundation now occupied 3 adjoining buildings just off the cliff walk. What had begun as a tea pavilion was now a humming network of classrooms, gardens, shared kitchens and reading rooms. The original gallery, its stone floor worn smooth by years of footfall, remained the heart of it all. It was there, under white awnings hung with ivy and lanterns, that the annual summer tea still took place, just as Dorothy had intended. She stood at the top of the gallery steps, dressed in soft cream with a pin at her collar, a silver kettle encircled by a new ring of laurel. Her hair, now streaked with threads of silver, was swept into a twist at her nape. At her side stood Archer, taller than memory and greyer at the temples, his hand resting lightly against her back. He had never stopped walking beside her, not in the public moments, not in the private ones. Theirs had been a quiet kind of love, no fanfare, no scandals, no declarations engraved in stone. Just shared labor, shared decisions, and glances across rooms that still carried the same weight as they had that first afternoon. And on the nights when the wind came in fierce from the water, they held each other like the foundation they had built together. They had not had children in the traditional sense, but the girls who had once passed through their doors and now returned as instructors, funders, advocates, and mothers of their own, those were their legacy. Some days, Dorothy would pause at the edge of a classroom and simply listen to the voices, the laughter, the strength. She had not lost the ability to cry quietly when no one was watching. Maribel now ran the Providence location of the academy and was in talks with the city to open a second training site in Pawtucket. Clara had become one of the most sought-after culinary consultants in New England, and her name appeared regularly in newspaper reviews. Ruth, now Ruth Mackenzie, had recently been elected to the Newport Town Council, becoming the first woman to hold a seat. At her swearing-in, she wore her old academy apron folded in her coat pocket. As for Mrs. Abernathy, she passed 2 years ago. In her will, she left a sealed letter addressed only to Dorothy, written in her final summer. It contained no apologies, only truth. You taught me that grace is not inherited, but chosen, every day. Dorothy kept it tucked between the pages of her father's old foundry ledger. Evelyn Lorimer had married a shipping heir and relocated to Paris. Her name appeared in the society pages from time to time, charity balls, diplomatic galas, but there was always something clipped and curated about her smile in the photographs. Rumor had it that she rarely spoke of her years in Newport. Her vengeance had cost her relevance, and in time, even that had faded. The scandal that once chased Dorothy like a shadow had long since evaporated in the face of purpose. What remained was not a correction of the record, but the writing of a new one, inked in dignity and daily work. On this summer's tea, the guests included judges, seamstresses, doctors' wives, and former maids who now sat as honored patrons. One table held 3 generations of Ashdown alumni. Another was made up entirely of boys, sons of dock workers, who had begun a program in hospitality and food justice. Inclusion had once been whispered about. Now it was printed on every invitation. Dorothy stood beside Archer as the final toast was given, not by her, but by a girl named Eleanor, 17 years old, who had once arrived at the academy barefoot and silent, and now stood in pressed linen, reading her speech without trembling. "To those who build," she said, "even when the world tells them they are not allowed." As the applause rose, Archer slipped his hand into Dorothy's. "It feels like yesterday," he said quietly, "and yet I can barely remember life before this." Dorothy didn't answer at first. Her eyes lingered on the garden, where the younger trainees were laughing, weaving flower stems into garlands. The wind lifted the hem of the linen tablecloths. The gallery, aglow with gold, looked like something out of a dream once feared, now fully lived. Then she looked at him, her voice calm and full. "It wasn't life before," she said. "It was waiting." He turned to her, and in his eyes she still saw the man who had once walked into the wrong pavilion and stayed. As the guests raised their cups one last time, the sound echoed softly over the cliffs, not thunderous, but sure. And in the waning light of a summer well-earned, Dorothy Ashdown smiled, because what they had built had not just endured, it had transformed. Every story we tell is a quiet invitation to believe again in dignity, in resilience, and in the kind of love that is not loud, but lasting. Dorothy's journey is a reminder that no title, no scandal, no gate ever built by society can keep a determined heart from rising. She didn't win because the world made room for her. She won because she carved a place for herself and opened the door for others. And Archer, he didn't save her. He stood beside her, and that made all the difference. Perhaps you saw yourself in Dorothy, the quiet battles, the moments you chose integrity over comfort, truth over silence. Or maybe you saw someone you love. In every tear, every breathless pause, and every cup of tea poured with purpose, we hope this story touched a part of you that needed to feel seen. If you made it all the way to the end, type worth in the comments. That one word says so much, doesn't it? Because that's what Dorothy fought for. Not wealth, not reputation, but worth. And if this story moved you, if it stayed with you after the final scene faded, consider leaving a super thanks in the amount you wish. Every gesture of support, no matter how small, helps our little team continue creating these stories with all the care, research, and heart they deserve. If that's not possible right now, we understand completely. Your presence, your time, and your voice already mean the world. Just by sharing this video with someone you care about, you help us more than you know. And if you're hungry for more stories like this, filled with heartache, strength, redemption, and unforgettable love, We've left some powerful ones for you in the video cards. Each one is waiting to be discovered, just like Dorothy's. Thank you for believing in the beauty of stories that linger. We'll be waiting for you in the next one.